Scene 1 of Written in the Stars opens on an intimate interruption rather than an explicit act, and that choice immediately frames the film's priorities. This is not about spectacle, but about the emotional fault lines that run beneath: desire, ambition, and loyalty. Veronica, a novelist newly arrived in Los Angeles to promote her first book, is caught between two worlds when her wife Melissa calls in the middle of a moment she has been sharing with Jezabel, a woman who represents immediacy, risk, and the intoxicating sense of being seen without history. The phone call functions as more than a plot device. It is a collision of identities, where Veronica is simultaneously the devoted spouse, the ambitious artist, and the woman who is quietly unraveling under the weight of wanting more than one truth at the same time. For queer audiences, this tension feels painfully familiar, not because infidelity is universal, but because the pressure to be grateful, stable, and good at after achieving hard-won legitimacy often leaves little room to acknowledge lingering hunger or uncertainty. Melissa's voice on the phone is steady, loving, and deeply supportive, embodying a kind of queer partnership built on sacrifice and belief. As she continues working so Veronica can chase her dream, a dynamic many women recognize from relationships shaped by uneven opportunity and emotional labor. Veronica's insistence that she is merely dealing with writer's block is not just a lie to her wife, but a lie to herself, a shorthand explanation that allows her to avoid naming the deeper creative and emotional disquiet she feels. The camera's imagined shift toward Jezabel waiting quietly on the bed underscores the contrast between patience and immediacy, between the known safety of long-term love and the electric vulnerability of new connection. A contrast that queer women often navigate in silence because society allows so little space for their complexity. Veronica's guilt is notably muted, not absent but secondary to her desire to return to Jezabel. And this emotional hierarchy challenges the cultural script that demands women, especially queer women, center responsibility over longing at all costs. Melissa's encouragement, her belief in Veronica's strength and talent, lands with bittersweet irony, because it highlights how love can coexist with blindness, and how being deeply cared for does not automatically resolve internal fractures. Rather than painting Melissa as naive or Jezabel as predatory, the scene treats all three women as fully human, each occupying a symbolic role that reflects real pressures placed on queer women. Melissa as the stabilizing force whose labor makes dreams possible, Jezabel as the mirror of untapped desire and creative fire, and Veronica as the woman stretched thin between gratitude and authenticity. The discomfort society feels toward women. Loving women is subtly present here, not through overt condemnation, but through the absence of language Veronica has to describe her truth without moral shorthand. Writer's block becomes a socially acceptable euphemism for emotional dissonance because naming queer desire outside monogamous expectation still feels dangerous. This discomfort persists because women's interior lives, particularly queer women's, threaten narratives of containment and resolution, and the film resists offering easy answers by lingering in Veronica's private moment of relief after hanging up the phone. Her whispered exchange of love with Melissa is sincere, not manipulative, which complicates any simplistic reading of betrayal and instead asks the audience to sit with the ache of divided selves. For women watching, queer or otherwise, this scene resonates as a meditation on how ambition can reopen questions we thought were settled, how support can feel both sustaining and suffocating, and how becoming visible to oneself sometimes happens in the least heroic circumstances. Written in the Stars begins by asserting that queer women's stories are not morality plays, but emotional constellations, shaped by devotion, desire, fear, and hope, and that acknowledging the messiness of those constellations is not a failure of love, but an honest step toward understanding who we are when no one else is watching. The scene's power also lies in how it reframes cheating not as titillation but as a symptom of unmet articulation, a silence that grows when women are taught to prioritize coherence over truth. Veronica's Los Angeles setting amplifies this. A city mythologized as a place of reinvention, where queer women are promised freedom yet often confront new versions of the same constraints. Jezabel's quiet presence during the call suggests a tenderness that refuses to demand explanation, offering Veronica a rare moment of acceptance without performance. That acceptance, however fleeting, exposes how rarely women are allowed to want without justification. By ending the scene in emotional suspension rather than consequence, the film honors the lived reality of queer longing, unresolved, complicated, and deeply human, insisting that visibility begins not with confession, but with the courage to feel fully at last. Scene 2 of Written in the Stars quietly shifts the film's emotional gravity by bringing Kenna back into the physical space of her marriage, forcing the audience to sit with the contrast between imagined freedom and lived intimacy. When Kenna returns home to Scarlett, there is no explosive confrontation or melodramatic reveal, only the familiar rhythm of two women who know each other well enough to argue about work schedules, exhaustion, and priorities without threatening the foundation of their bond. This ordinariness is precisely what makes the scene so resonant, especially for queer audiences who rarely see lesbian marriages depicted as mundane, functional, and imperfect in the same ways heterosexual ones are allowed to be. Kenna's affair in Los Angeles hangs invisibly in the room, unspoken but palpable, shaping the way she listens, the way she hesitates, and the way she studies her wife, as if seeing her both as anchor and obstacle. Scarlett, meanwhile, is not portrayed as a passive or oblivious partner, but as a woman equally consumed by her own work and responsibilities, someone who loves Kenna deeply yet exists on a different wavelength at this moment in their lives. Their conversation reflects a familiar tension for many women, the sense that two people can be committed and affectionate while still missing each other emotionally, speaking adjacent languages shaped by career pressures, fatigue, and the quiet fear of falling out of sync. When they kiss and make up after a small argument, it is not a grand reconciliation but a practiced ritual, an acknowledgement that love does not dissolve at the first sign of friction, a depiction that challenges the idea that queer relationships must either be utopian or tragic to be meaningful. As Kenna lies beside Scarlett afterward, her internal question about whether compromising one's career goals is simply what marriage requires cuts to the heart of a dilemma many women face, particularly queer women who have fought so hard to claim both professional ambition and relational legitimacy. The film resists offering a definitive answer, instead allowing the question to linger as Kenna watches her wife move through the familiar intimacy of shared space, changing into pajamas, settling into the night, embodying a comfort that is both soothing and confining. Scarlett's presence pulls Kenna out of abstraction and back into her body, back into the reality of a love that is not fueled by secrecy or novelty but by history, trust, and mutual care. The way Kenna's thoughts shift from doubt to desire is not framed as a moral correction but as an emotional truth. Longing for one's spouse can coexist with restlessness, and choosing intimacy does not automatically erase uncertainty. For lesbian viewers, this portrayal can feel especially affirming because it refuses to flatten marriage into either a reward for past struggle or a prison that stifles individuality, instead presenting it as a living, evolving negotiation shaped by external pressures and internal change. Scarlett's role in this scene is quietly powerful. She represents the stability that allows Kenna to dream at all, the partner whose labor and emotional availability have made Kenna's career possible, even as that same stability becomes something Kenna fears losing herself within. Kenna, in turn, embodies the woman caught between gratitude and self-definition, wrestling with the fear that wanting more might make her ungrateful, disloyal, or selfish, a fear deeply ingrained in women who are taught to prioritize harmony over honesty. The scene also reflects society's discomfort with women, and especially queer women, expressing desire within long-term relationships, as if passion must inevitably fade into practicality. By lingering on Kenna's renewed awareness of Scarlett's beauty and her hunger to be close to her, the film pushes back against the narrative that domesticity and desire are mutually exclusive. At the same time, the unspoken affair complicates this moment, reminding viewers that desire alone is not a moral compass, and that visibility to oneself does not always arrive neatly or painlessly. The emotional safety of the scene lies in its refusal to sensationalize any of this, choosing instead to honor the quiet contradictions that define adult love, devotion alongside doubt, affection alongside frustration, and the ache of wanting to be fully seen without knowing how to ask for it. For women watching, queer or otherwise, this scene may resonate as a mirror of their own nights spent beside someone they love, wondering which parts of themselves are negotiable and which are not, and whether intimacy is something that must be protected, reinvented, or courageously reimagined. By centering tenderness rather than judgment, Written in the Stars invites its audience to recognize that becoming visible is not always about leaving or staying, but about daring to acknowledge the complexity of loving another woman while still learning how to love oneself. Scene 3 of Written in the Stars detonates the film's carefully layered tensions by collapsing secrecy into shared space, forcing all three women into an emotional constellation that feels both intimate and destabilizing. Veronica's shock at finding Jezabel seated in her wife's living room is not simply about surprise, but about the terror of recognition, the sudden realization that the private compartment she constructed to contain her desire has ruptured. Her instinct to demand Jezabel leave is less cruelty than panic, the reflex of someone who knows her inner life has been exposed without her consent. In that moment, Jezabel's calm assurance that she knows exactly what she is doing reads as deeply unsettling, not because she is malicious, but because she is unafraid, embodying a confidence and presence that Veronica herself has lacked throughout her duplicity. Veronica's internal spiral, wondering whether Jezabel is deliberately trying to destroy her marriage, reveals a familiar pattern for many women, projecting agency and danger onto another woman rather than confronting one's own choices. When Melissa enters and responds not with suspicion but with polite shock at Veronica's rudeness, the scene subtly reframes the power dynamic, positioning Melissa as emotionally grounded, socially gracious, and unexpectedly open. Her apology to Jezabel underscores her instinct toward care and responsibility, qualities that have quietly sustained her marriage, while Veronica pursued her ambitions elsewhere. The introduction of Jezabel as someone connected to the foundation reframes her yet again, not as an intruder, but as a legitimate presence in Melissa's world, which only deepens Veronica's discomfort. Veronica's cool smirk and swift exit function as an act of self-protection, an attempt to reclaim control by withdrawing, but it also signals her inability to remain present when faced with emotional complexity. For queer audiences, this moment resonates as a painful illustration of how secrecy corrodes intimacy not through exposure alone, but through the fear of being truly seen by those we love most. The following morning's quieter encounter between Melissa and Jezabel shifts the tone entirely, trading confrontation for suspended intimacy. Alone together, the two women inhabit a space charged not by betrayal but by curiosity, gentleness, and the fragile thrill of recognition. Melissa's reflection on their growing friendship carries a sincerity that contrasts sharply with Veronica's guardedness, suggesting that connection, when allowed to develop without deceit, can feel expansive rather than threatening. Jezabel's tender gesture of releasing Melissa's tightly bound hair operates as a powerful visual metaphor, symbolizing the loosening of roles, expectations, and self-restraint that Melissa has long carried. Hair, often associated with femininity and vulnerability, becomes here a language of care, an invitation to be seen not just as a wife or supporter, but as a woman with her own desires and interiority. The tension between them is not framed as predatory or reckless, but as a quiet awakening, the recognition of chemistry that does not demand immediate action yet refuses to be ignored. Melissa's awareness of her marriage adds weight rather than shame to the moment, illustrating how attraction does not erase commitment but complicates it, asking difficult questions about authenticity and emotional truth. For lesbian viewers, this depiction is particularly resonant because it refuses simplistic binaries of faithful versus unfaithful, instead portraying desire as something that emerges from emotional resonance, shared vulnerability, and being fully present with another woman. Society's discomfort with women expressing desire for each other, especially within existing relationships, is evident in how such stories are often flattened into scandal or moral failure. Yet this scene resists that framing by grounding every interaction in empathy and internal conflict, rather than spectacle. Jezabel's role evolves from lover to mirror, reflecting both Veronica's avoidance and Melissa's quiet longing, while Melissa becomes the emotional center, embodying the cost of always being the steady one without ever being asked what she herself wants. Veronica, though absent in the latter half of the scene, remains omnipresent through the tension she has created, representing the woman who has pursued self-fulfillment without reckoning with the relational consequences. The scene ultimately asks its audience to consider how often women, particularly queer women, are taught to justify, minimize, or suppress their desires to preserve harmony, and how visibility, being seen by another woman without pretense, can feel both liberating and terrifying. By allowing Melissa and Jezabel's connection to unfold in silence, glances, and restrained gestures, the film honors the complexity of emotional intimacy without rushing toward resolution, reminding viewers that awakening is rarely clean or comfortable. In centering women's interior lives rather than sensational outcomes, Written in the Stars offers a deeply human exploration of longing, accountability, and the courage it takes to remain open in the presence of desire, inviting audiences to sit with ambiguity rather than flee from it, and to recognize that becoming visible is often the most radical act of all. Scene 4 of Written in the Stars confronts the raw aftermath of betrayal by turning inward rather than outward, framing Melissa's discovery of the affair not as a spectacle of confrontation, but as an implosion of identity, trust, and emotional grounding. The opening question about what it feels like to learn that the love of your life has cheated functions as an invitation into Melissa's body, where shock manifests as heat, breathlessness, and an almost feral alertness, reminding viewers that betrayal is not abstract but deeply physical, particularly for women who have built their lives around emotional labor and relational stability. Melissa's rage is complicated by hypocrisy because she herself crossed a boundary with Jezabel, yet the scene refuses to reduce her reaction to simple moral failure, instead portraying how grief often narrows perspective, allowing self-justification to masquerade as survival. Her forgetting of her own betrayal is not portrayed as deceitful calculation but as dissociation, a desperate attempt to locate a clear villain in a moment when her internal world feels unmoored. For queer audiences, this contradiction resonates powerfully, reflecting how women in same-sex relationships are often denied scripts for navigating infidelity, leaving them to improvise responses amid cultural silence. Melissa's desire to see how Veronica kissed Jezabel is especially striking, not as voyeurism, but as an effort to regain narrative control over a story that has slipped from her hands. Wanting to witness the intimacy that excluded her becomes a way of translating abstract pain into something graspable, a painful but human impulse to understand how love was redirected without her consent. Her impulse to punish Veronica through Jezabel reveals how women are often conditioned to reroute anger laterally rather than confront systemic or relational breakdowns directly, turning other women into symbols rather than people. Jezabel's role in this dynamic is deeply symbolic, positioned between projection and personhood, bearing the weight of both women's unresolved needs and unspoken longings. Rather than being framed as a temptress or antagonist, she becomes a mirror, reflecting the fractures already present in the marriage and the unaddressed desires simmering beneath its surface. This reframing challenges society's tendency to vilify women who become entangled in affairs while excusing the relational conditions that made such entanglements possible. Veronica, too, exists here less as a villain than as a woman caught between ambition, validation, and avoidance, whose inability to be emotionally present has forced intimacy into secret spaces rather than shared ones. Melissa's quest for stability underscores a universal theme for women viewers, the longing for emotional footing when identity is built in relation to another, and that relation suddenly collapses. Her actions, though ethically fraught, are rooted in a need to feel real again, to replace chaos with sensation, clarity, or even pain that can be named. The scene also speaks to broader discomfort with women expressing rage, desire, and contradictions simultaneously, especially queer women, whose emotions are often expected to be either sanitized or sensationalized. By allowing Melissa to occupy an unstable middle ground, hurt, angry, hypocritical, longing, the film insists on her full humanity rather than demanding moral purity. This insistence is radical in a cultural landscape that frequently flattens lesbian relationships into ideals or cautionary tales, leaving little room for messiness. The dynamic among Melissa, Veronica, and Jezabel mirrors real-world pressures on queer women to explain themselves endlessly, to justify desire, and to absorb blame quietly to preserve social palatability. Instead of offering easy resolution, the scene lingers in discomfort, honoring the truth that healing rarely begins with clarity. Ultimately, Scene 4 reframes betrayal not as the end of love, but as a revelation of truths long avoided, asking viewers to sit with the pain of visibility and to recognize that becoming honest, even when it hurts, is the first step toward reclaiming agency, selfhood, and emotional integrity. For lesbian and broader LGBTQ+ viewers, this moment resonates because it refuses to simplify love into loyalty alone, acknowledging instead how desire, fear, and silence can coexist inside long-term partnerships. It challenges the myth that queer relationships are inherently more evolved or immune to betrayal, while also rejecting the notion that failure invalidates their legitimacy. Melissa's fixation on reenacting or witnessing the affair exposes how women are taught to process pain through self-surveillance, rather than self-compassion, internalizing blame even as they rage outward. The scene quietly critiques this conditioning by showing how destructive it can become when emotional truth is deferred too long. In centering women's interior lives rather than explicit acts, the film invites audiences to recognize their own unspoken resentments, avoided conversations, and hidden desires, asking not who is right or wrong, but what it costs to remain unseen. It leaves viewers unsettled yet seen, reminding us that queer love stories deserve complexity, accountability, and space to break before they can ever rebuild honestly.